It's Christmas time in the Appalachians, and the holidays are as big a deal here as they are anywhere. That being said, Grandpa's been keeping me pretty busy lately. On December 1st, as I lay sleeping off the leftovers of Thanksgiving turkey, which we'd been eating all week, Grandpa shook me awake and said it was time we got started. I tried to roll over, tried to tell him to let me sleep a bit longer. He just shook me again and told me to get up and help him get the things from the attic. When I asked what things we were getting, he looked shocked. "Why, Christmas decorations. We have to make sure everything's ready for the season." Grandpa has always been a nut for Christmas time. I can remember visiting my grandparents during the holidays, smelling the aromas of the season as I walked through the door. Gingerbread, sugar cookies, Grandma's traditional fruitcake, which she usually gave as gifts and tasted better than anything from the store, and the cinnamon miasma of homemade cider. Grandma baked from November 22nd to January 5th, and our house always seemed to contain a pie or a cookie or some other confection she had whipped up for the season. And while Grandma baked, Grandpa decorated. As we set it all up, I realized the Herculean effort Grandpa must have gone into every year to make the house look as festive as possible. Garland was stretched on every eve, mistletoe hung in bushels, lights twinkled merrily, and the sounds of Christmas decorations, as well as the wooden decorations that Grandpa carved, were everywhere. Some of you have asked on that note what Grandpa does with himself to keep busy, and I'm here to tell you that he's one of the best woodworkers in the valley. He makes furniture, walking sticks, many other pieces that he usually sells at the flea market, usually around this time of year actually. Even the most jaded child's eyes would often light up at the sight of a deer or a wolf that Grandpa had cozied out of a block of pine or spruce or maple, and many of the intricate decor pieces looked very homey against the singing horde of Walmart abominations. After a week of setting up plastic deer, hanging Christmas lights, and nailing garland around the house, I felt tired and a little Scroogey. I had already figured in my head that, come the 1st of January, I was going to have to take all this crap down and help him stow it again. Grandpa had thrown up half a Walmart holiday section and a quarter of the local hardware store's holly jolly aisle. I just knew that it would take a week to get this all back in the attic, and the thought was making me testy already. I was hanging stockings from the fireplace when I heard a sudden chirp of a cricket. I jumped a little, not expecting to hear the sudden invasion of the insect. I hadn't heard a cricket since the cold front a few weeks ago. He was a big fella, too. His body was coal black, and his legs were long and sinuous. He sounded off again, hopping a little closer to the crackling fire, and I reached slowly for the magazine sitting on the end table. This guy had clearly been hiding amongst the decorations, and I didn't want to have to deal with him until spring. When my hand met resistance, I looked back to see that Grandpa had caught the end of my magazine. "Don't do it, boy. It could be the worst mistake of your life." I gave him a strange look, but relaxed my arm nonetheless. "Sounds like maybe you have some experience with this sort of thing," I said, moving over to help Grandpa with the tree as he prepared to spin another of his yarns. Grandpa put a hand down for the cricket, and it seemed to come to him as though it knew him. "It was the worst month of my life, that's for sure," he began, putting the cricket on his shoulder as he began his story with his usual flair. "'Twas the night after Thanksgiving, and all through our home, no one was sleeping. A cricket did roam. The cricket had been waking us up every night for 2 weeks. No one knew where he'd come from. Snow would come early to the mountain that year, and there was never a time when there wasn't at least a few inches on the ground after Halloween. A blizzard was coming, and the old-timers were predicting feet of snow for Christmas. 2 of my cousins, John and Matthew, were staying with us for the foreseeable future. Their parents were up north and snowbound by a sudden blizzard. They had sent a letter with some money and asked us to look after them until they could get back. We were happy to oblige. Unlike Luke, they were good company. All of us were around the same age, 10 or close enough, and we spent our days in the yard building snowmen, having snowball fights, and sledding. It could have been one of the best Christmases of my life, were it not for the cricket and what it brought with it. The cricket was still alive for two very good reasons. The first was that, as everyone in the Appalachians knows, a cricket on your hearth, especially at Christmas time, is good luck. My grandma said so, and my mother and father, not typically superstitious, also said so. Despite its chirping keeping us awake, my parents refused to kill it. They always held firm to the idea that the cricket would bring good luck, but I suspect there was another side of that coin that they weren't telling us. The other reason was just as simple. We couldn't find him. We suspected that he was in the chimney, but he didn't seem too bothered by the heat from our fireplace. My parents assumed he was in a crevice in the stonework, and that's why his chirping was so loud. His chirping would come vibrating down the chimney stack and quaver across the house so all could suffer his noise. Then, one day, I suppose I had finally had enough. It was late, the middle of the night, and the cricket had been sounding off every hour. A single loud chirp that would scrape across my consciousness like a razor and bring me shuddering awake. After 7 or 8 days of this, I was getting rattled, and the lack of real sleep was starting to make us all a little cranky. No matter how many pillows you put over your head, or how hard you stuffed the cotton in your ears, or whatever you decided to do to block out the noise, the sound would shiver into your eardrums and bring you awake with jarring clarity. I had gotten up to get a drink of water when I finally saw the little bastard. I was walking to the kitchen when I heard him chirp. I turned to look at the crackling fire, and I saw his tiny form dancing in the backdrop. He was just sitting there, warming himself and chirping happily. I reached towards the counter as my hand closed around the fly swatter, knowing I was about to end his reign of terror. I could hear my grandmother's voice whispering that I shouldn't do it, but my sleep-deprived mind only wanted one thing. I wanted peace. I wanted quiet. And above all else, I wanted to sleep. The cricket looked up at me as though to ask if it could help me. His body crunched as I brought the swatter down on him, and for a moment I basked in the sudden quiet as I headed back to bed. But that silence wouldn't last long. No sooner had I climbed back into bed, snuggling down and getting ready to sleep, than I heard it again, the merry chirp of a cricket. My eyes popped open. I looked around my room for the source of the noise. The room was empty, filled with the shadows cast by the moon as it played amongst my toys and clothes and other objects hanging around. The chirp had sounded close, though, like it was in the room with me. It had been annoying before, but now it was so loud I could barely stand it. I was getting ready to hunker down, thinking I was imagining things, when a small black shape jumped closer to the bed. It was framed in the moonlight, its antenna wiggling intently, and its shape was impossible to mistake. I covered my head with my pillow, burrowing under the quilts and blankets I had piled on my bed to keep warm. They did little to stop my shivering as I lay hunkered beneath them, unsure of what to do next. Was it following me? Was it a ghost? I had left the cricket as a smear on the stone in the living room. I didn't know what to make of this new cricket, but its presence definitely spooked me. When it sounded off beneath the covers, I jumped, scuttling backwards as I tried to get some distance between it and me. I could feel something on my face, its pinchy feet scuttling over my lips and cheek, and I slapped my hand to my face trying to swipe it away. It seemed to be one step ahead of my searching hands, though, and when I felt the legs touch my ear, I slapped at the side of my head hard enough to make my ears ring. Despite my ringing ears, though, I still felt the cricket slide into my head, and my horror made me shudder in silence. I felt the tears leak down my face as the sharp tweet of the cricket came from right inside my ear, sounding huge and deafening. I didn't sleep a wink that night. I was too busy hearing the cricket as he chirped inside my noggin. I woke up groggy and scared, unsure if I had been dreaming or if any of it had actually happened. I stuck my finger in my ear and rooted, not feeling anything. The chirping was gone, and by the light of day, I could believe that it was all just a dream. I could hear people talking quietly in the living room, and I rolled out of bed, ready to start another day of fun. My cousins were up already when I staggered into the living room. They were sipping mugs of heavily doctored coffee and looking at the snow as it came down. As I stood watching the fresh powder fall, I winced when a sudden loud chirp blistered my eardrums. I was on the verge of hyperventilating, having come to terms with the fact that it had indeed been real. My eyes felt like they might bug out of my head, and I staggered back a step as I clutched my ear. "What's wrong with you?" John asked, looking at me strangely. Cricket," I gasped, putting a finger in my ear and shaking it. I felt nothing. Nothing came out, but I knew what I had heard. "I know, isn't it great?" Matthew said. "First good night's sleep I've had all week. I didn't hear that little bugger all night." "Me either," John agreed, and they clinked their mugs together in celebration. I was glad they had slept well, but it appeared my troubles were just beginning. The snow came down, piling high enough to cover Daddy's truck, and Mama was afraid that we would be snowbound soon. We had a lot of supplies laid in, but with 5 of us living here 24 hours a day, the supplies were likely to only last a few weeks. We were just kids, though, and while my parents worried about supplies, we played in the snow. I had hoped that the cold might deter the cricket, maybe even draw him out, but I never felt him stir all day. What I did feel was his ear-piercing chirps at random times throughout the day. When I came inside later, I had developed a slight twitch from the sudden and unpredictable chirping of the cricket. As the days persisted, my mother became concerned at the jumpy, twitchy way I was starting to act. The chirps were like an ice pick in my head, and I knew that I wouldn't sleep a wink that night for the noise. As I lay awake, hearing the pair of crickets chirping at odd intervals in my skull, I remember the crickets chirp from the living room as a happy memory. The week that followed was a bit of a blur. I lived in a state of constant pain. I don't think I slept more than a few minutes a night. Sometimes the thing would chirp ceaselessly, making my head ring like the inside of a bell. Sometimes he would lure me into a false sense of security, though, by not chirping for hours, only to chirp loudly just as I would drift off to sleep. Sometimes it would sound like one cricket. Sometimes it would sound like a whole swarm of crickets had hopped in and started chirping around inside my head. By the end of that week, I was ready for the funny farm, and I worried that my life would never be the same again. Luckily for me, Grandma came through again. After 7 straight days, the snow was halfway up the window. It had been falling steadily, and a real blizzard was brewing outside. We had all been kept inside as Daddy tried to keep the front door clear, and my cousins were reading or playing with toys as I slowly went mad. I was sitting in the corner, the twitching becoming worse by the day, and everyone had started avoiding me. I was deteriorating mentally since the cricket had gotten into my ear, becoming a prisoner in my own body. I shook. I made strange noises. I pissed my pants sometimes. I seemed to cry ceaselessly. I had seen a kid at school once that had fits, and he had sat in the back and twitched just this way. I remembered being scared that I would be like this forever, and I remembered praying to God to help get this cricket out of my head. As if in response, the door burst open, and my grandma came in with a bundle of firewood under each arm. Grandma had come from her house to ours, and no one was quite sure how she had carried 2 large stacks of firewood through the snow like that. Mama had my cousins take the firewood and set Grandma down by the fire. She didn't immediately see me, but her eyes grew wide and concerned when she did. She didn't say anything then, but she came to my room after my parents and cousins went to bed that night to talk to me. "What have you done, my love?" she asked as I lay in bed. I turned my weeping eyes to hers and stuttered out the whole story. I told her about the cricket, the constant chirping, the erosion of my mental state, and she just nodded. I explained it through the chirping explosions of my head's house guest, and she seemed ready to weep with me every time I twitched. She took it all in, and when I was done, she got up and said she needed some things from her house. "It may take me some time to get the things I need, but I think I can remove this curse from you. Stay strong, love. I'll be back as quickly as I can." For the next 3 days, I neither ate nor slept. Mama fussed over me, trying to get me to eat something. Daddy thought I had just gone stir-crazy and told her just to wait and see if I would snap out of it. My cousins were curious, but ultimately grew tired of watching me lie in bed and drool on my quilt. Inside my head, the crickets were the only ones who kept me company. Their chirping grew more erratic as time went on. Mama changed my clothes when I messed myself, but eventually she just left me naked with a towel under me. I don't remember those days very well. I mostly just existed. Mama was getting worried about Grandma, too. She just left out into the snow without a word. What happens if she freezes out there? "Don't you worry, Pook," my daddy said to her. "Mama's been living in these mountains for a long time. She knows how to come and go without much fuss." I hoped, in as much capacity as I could hope, that he was right. Grandma couldn't get lost in the mountains. Could she? I had seen her navigate these hills with ease in any season. The thought that she could get herself lost was laughable at best, but the thought that a cricket could infest my mind had seemed silly too a few weeks ago. Then, sometime in the wee hours of the 4th day, I looked up, and she was there. She picked me up as easy as a rag doll and took me through the dark house. The boards creaked sleepily, and the snow pattered gently on the window. I could hear the sounds of my family as they snored around us, and if they heard us, they never stirred. She took me into the bathroom and locked the door, sitting me into the heavy tub that had been Daddy's wedding present to Mama all those years ago. She poured in water, cold and fresh, as she opened her bag. She also had several buckets of lukewarm water, and I felt my skin break out in goose prickles as I lay there in the semi-warmth. "Hold still now, and don't interrupt," she said, pouring a packet of dried something on me. She sprinkled me with dust, with herbs, with salves, and even something that stung my eyes and made my skin tingle. She chanted as she did it, and I could see the flicker of flames as she spoke in her grandmother's tongue, as she called it. She spoke something long and musical, something deep and winding, and as I felt a wiggle in my ear, I sucked in a ragged breath. It felt like someone was pulling steel wool out of my head, and I gritted my teeth as I waited for it to be over. Suddenly, I heard a loud plop as it fell into the tub. I turned my head to look, but Grandma hissed at me to be still. She likely knew what was coming next, but I was unprepared for the sudden torrent. My ears began to buzz, and my head felt like it might burst. I could hear the ringing of 1,000 different crickets, and I felt them pouring out and filling the tub. Their feet and antennae scraped at my ears. Their shrill cries made me want to scream, and as they fell into the water, I heard them tweet in pain as they drowned. My grandmother lifted me out suddenly, holding me close as the sounds of the dying insects grew louder and louder. When it finally stopped, we cried together, my ears mercifully quiet. I looked at him, the firelight twinkling in his eyes as he came back from that long ago Christmas time. "So, your grandmother cured you?" I asked. "Well, sort of. I've had a persistent ringing in my ear ever since, but the chirping was indeed gone. A few days later, and I was back to my old self, though I could still swear I heard the phantom cricket sounds for about a week after she took the curse off me." My eyes went a little wide then. "The cricket cursed you?" Grandpa nodded. "It was all my grandmother could figure. The little critter had been killed needlessly, and instead of good luck, it had bestowed a curse instead. Grandma said I had been lucky she had come around. The cricket in my head would have eventually become too much, and I would have probably died or gone too crazy to ever come back from it." I looked back to the cricket, now showing a bit more respect. What will you do with that fella?" Grandpa told me to follow him, and he took me back into his room. In his bathroom, the whole thing wrapped with a towel to keep the cold out, was a small mesh cage that contained about 5 or 6 sluggish crickets. They nibbled on potato slices, drank water from a dish, and hopped around the wood chips on the floor of the cage. Grandpa added his new friend to the cage and smiled at me as he closed the little door. "I'll take them to the woods when it gets warm, the ones that last the winter anyway. I always release them come spring, so they can bring luck to others next winter." I hugged him then, glad he had saved me from something similar to the fate that he had endured, and he patted my back happily. Now, come on," he said a few minutes later, listening to the crickets tooting up in their cage. "We have to make this place ready for Santa Claus. I met him once. Did I ever tell you about that?" And as we went back to our decorating, he told me about a night in Alaska where he had indeed met the jolly old man himself. From all of us here at Grandpa's cabin, nestled down in the North Georgia mountains, Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. May the cricket on your fireplace bring you luck in the years to come. Good evening, everyone. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining me for tonight's story. I always love any excuse to go back to Grandpa's cabin in the Appalachian woods, and I'm glad we could bring you a little bit of Christmas cheer along the way tonight. Let's go ahead and thank our sponsors before I sign off for the night. Thanks to Leslie Lou Riddle for being our Spooky Skeleton tier contributor. Thanks, Leslie. We just couldn't do it without you. If you too would like to become one of my Spooky Skeleton tier contributors, come on down to Patreon. For just $5 a month, you can have your name read out at the end of every video and every TikTok that I make. Also, it's certainly not too late to get one of my books. There's a link below to my Amazon site. I'm sure we have something to keep you warm and toasty this holiday season as you sit by the fire or wherever it is that you get comfortable. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening and a spooky new year.